Welcome to This is Getting Old, Moving Towards an Age-Friendly World. I'm your host, Melissa Batchelor, and today I'm joined by Ames Simmons, and we're going to be talking about Alzheimer's disease in transgender people. So welcome, Ames. How are you?
I am great. Thank you for having me, Melissa.
So before we begin, maybe just tell people a little bit about yourself.
Sure. My name is Ames Simmons, and my pronouns are he and him. I teach a transgender seminar at the law school at Duke University, and I'm also in the process of getting a graduate certificate from George Washington University in LGBTQ Health Policy and Practice. And the subject that we're talking about today is what my capstone project is on.
Great. So before we get started, maybe just give us some definitions of some of the terms that we might be using today in case people aren't quite familiar with them.
Sure. Yes. Vocabulary tends to change quickly in the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer or LGBTQ community. So while this terminology is currently correct here in March of 2023, it might not be a month from now or a year from now. When I'm using the word transgender, I'm using it to describe anyone whose gender identity or their internal sense of their gender is different from the sex that they were assigned at birth. I'm a queer, white, transgender man. I was assigned female at birth, and I identify as a man. So this is in contrast to cisgender people whose gender identity aligns with the sex that they were assigned at birth. So it's probably more than 90% of the population is cisgender. There's also terms like non-binary or gender diverse or gender expansive that refer to people who don't identify with any gender, or who might identify with more than one gender, or identify as gender fluid. Some people who are non-binary identify as members of the transgender community, but not all do. So I always say, if you've met one trans or non-binary person, you've just met one trans or non-binary person. It's important to find out how the person in front of you identifies.
Right, and that's true for most people, not to make assumptions, but try to get to know them and their beliefs and not make assumptions or stereotype people. But one of the things that you and I have talked about is with when it comes to Alzheimer's disease, that there are some differences in the transgender population compared to other populations. So maybe just tell us a little bit about some of the statistics for this population when it comes to Alzheimer's disease.
Sure. There's not a lot of research. This is true about practically any subject of healthcare related to transgender and non-binary people who just have been understudied in research. But there's emerging research that shows that trans people are almost 6 times as likely to report subjective cognitive decline than cisgender people. And it's even higher for transgender people of color. This is research that our mutual friend Ethan Cicero just published related to the impact of subjective cognitive decline, which is one of the early potential signs of dementia or of Alzheimer's disease. Not quite the same thing. Their research interestingly showed that intersections are really important here. And they found that the highest rates of subjective cognitive decline were reported by American Indian or Alaska Native and Latina transgender men, and American Indian or Alaska Native and Latina gender non-conforming people, even compared to white cisgender people who are in the study. So, and the rates are, there's a statistical significance to the disproportionality, and it's something that we need to be paying attention to.
Okay, so how does aging just in and of itself impact transgender people?
Well, it's not all that surprising, honestly, given what we know about the impact of marginalization on LGBTQ older adults. We know from research on the broader LGBTQ community that chronic minority stress, or the stress that results from having to live and make your way in a society where homophobia and transphobia are part of the structures and institutions of our society, that chronic minority stress heightens the risk for premature cognitive aging. And we know that in the bigger LGBTQ community, that higher rates of subjective cognitive decline have been found among LGBTQ older adults who are people of color, and LGBTQ people who report depression or functional impairment. And that bears out also within the trans community. The trans community also has reported higher rates of depression, stress, disability, and poor health. And in research that came out of the Pride study through Stanford last year, this is a paper from Nick Lambrou. Investigators found that almost 16% of the trans and non-binary people in that survey reported that their memory was poor or fair, and that about that same percentage reported that their memory was worse than a year ago. And while we don't know, while we can tell that there is an impact, it's not clear exactly how dementia impacts gender identity. It might cause new or increased gender fluidity among some people. Some trans people may forget that they have had gender affirming procedures. But we do know that it can have a bigger impact on trans and non-binary people who have faced discrimination. In this Pride study report, they found that trans older adults who had experienced transgender related discrimination were 7.5 times more likely to report poor or fair memory. So not only is minority stress making transgender people sicker, but providers who are supposed to be mitigating that minority stress are actually making it worse by discriminating against patients. And again, that is borne out in the research. In one report, 1 in 5 palliative care providers reported that they had actually observed discrimination towards transgender patients.
Right. And I think a lot of it goes back to what you mentioned before, is that we really just need more research in this area and with this population. And when you and I first started talking about doing this podcast, I was preparing a hospice and palliative care course. And I was like, you know what? There's no information in here. So we largely have a workforce that, hasn't gotten the skill set for, geriatrics or Alzheimer's care. And this is just another component of that, where we need to do more research and to educate our workforce. So along those lines, what do you think is important for healthcare providers to know about memory loss and transgender people?
Well, I think that you're really right that there's not enough education in medical school, in social work and nursing school, or other training that healthcare providers get. Whether that we certainly know that folks are not getting enough education as concerns the LGBTQ community, and particularly that there is a thirst for more information about trans and non-binary people. Also, people are not getting enough education about aging. As you've mentioned on your podcast many times, the percentage of people who are over age 65 is increasing rapidly in our country. And unless we begin educating people to help care for those people who are aging, our workforce is not going to be able to respond to it. And certainly in long-term care now, we already know that there are workforce shortages. This can be really important when it comes to trans people, who are much more likely to report some type of discrimination or mistreatment by a healthcare provider. So 1 in 2 transgender people, so half of trans people, report mistreatment by a healthcare provider. So I've experienced this. Most trans and non-binary people that I know have at least one anecdote about discrimination or mistreatment that they have encountered. And because of that, fear and anxiety among trans people is high. The percentage of people, perhaps not surprisingly, given structural racism in our country, is much higher for transgender people of color. 68% of trans people of color report experiencing mistreatment from a healthcare provider. And in long-term care, this can look like misgendering, or not referring, not acknowledging the patient or resident's gender identity, or using the wrong name or pronouns for that person. It can include ridicule. It can include substandard or delayed care, or not giving any care at all, being denied care. And there are not very many long-term care providers who have non-discrimination policies in place that would help to prevent some of that mistreatment and discrimination from happening. And in particular, trans people are afraid about their gender identity not being respected in long-term care. Some people are afraid that their transness might be viewed as a symptom of dementia or psychosis, for example. Or trans people might be afraid that their age or cognitive decline might result in the termination of their gender affirming medical care. I was recently in a focus group where some older trans folks reported that they were denied estrogen because of their age for no other reason than that. And that can really create what I think of as a perceived powerlessness feedback loop among trans people. So a feedback loop happens when the output of a process returns to the input. So with trans people, this circle looks like experiences with healthcare discrimination in the past make trans people afraid of additional discrimination and worse treatment in long-term care if we can't advocate for ourselves. And that fear of accessing services has been shown in research to actually be a mediator of poor physical and mental health. And the diminution of cognitive abilities means that trans people might be less able to advocate for ourselves in long-term care settings. And so that loss of agency over or control over how our gender identity is expressed is the aspect of dementia that trans people most report fearing. 1 in 6 trans people have reported that they fear that dementia will disempower them or make them unable to preserve their sense of gender identity. And trans people of color, again, are twice as likely to report that fear as white transgender people. And that's probably because white trans people have more structural and institutional privilege to try to make sure that their gender identity is respected in long-term care. But that sense of powerlessness can make the options seem really limited for trans and non-binary people. Like maybe you might be able to afford care at home by a chosen caregiver if you can afford in-home nursing care, which trans people are much less likely to have the resources to be able to afford in-home nursing care because of lower incomes, because of historic discrimination in the trans community. If you have faced chronic unemployment or underemployment, you're much less likely to have those resources accumulated. And that's reported by, more than twice as many trans people as the general population, with even higher rates among trans people of color. Many people turn to family members as caregivers, and trans people are less likely to have family members to provide that care because of disproportionate rates of rejection by family members. So, almost half of trans people in one study reported that they had faced some type of family rejection. And again, there are higher rates of family rejection among trans people of color. So if you are looking at the reality of having care in a nursing home or in some type of long-term care facility. Some trans people might try to maximize the amount of gender affirming treatment that they've had, get as many surgeries and procedures as possible in order to blend in as the gender that they understand themselves to be in a long-term care setting. But that takes money, or it takes insurance, and trans people are also less likely to be able to have insurance that would cover that kind of healthcare. So, then the options start to narrow to either I will have to detransition or retransition to the sex that I was assigned at birth in order to feel safer in a long-term care setting where, personal care workers are going to have access to parts of your body that might disclose your transness, whether you tell people or not. The idea of going back to the sex that was assigned at birth is just so unthinkable for many trans people that some trans people, their plan is that I will die by suicide before, dementia sets in and before I have to go into a long-term care setting. And that, I think, is an emergency. Like, that's something that is not an acceptable state of affairs. As we have right now 171-ish thousand transgender people who are over the age of 65. And that's a significant number of people who are having a mental health crisis, thinking about what's going to happen in the event of dementia and long-term care. And that is what motivated me to make this the subject of my capstone research at GW.
The George Washington University School of Nursing has 3 highly ranked online master's program options to help you get there. Check out our adult gerontology nurse practitioner in either acute care or primary care, and our psychiatric mental health nurse practitioner programs. All 3 are in high demand with excellent starting salaries. Applications to start our programs in the fall are due each year in May, and to start in the spring, applications are due in October. You can learn more and get exact due dates by visiting our website, nursing.gwu.edu. Right. And I think one important thing to keep in mind is that, a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease or dementia could still, you don't know how quickly you're going to decline. And anyone over the age of 65, only 4 to 5% ever end up in a nursing home requiring, but there's this a continuum of long-term care settings, and choices are important for everyone, but this certainly is a different thing to consider. And so so in addition to screening for suicide risk, which we should be doing for all adults over the age of 65, what are some other things that providers could be or should be talking to their transgender patients about as they age, to kind of promote this autonomy and to make sure that their wishes are known, and then actually having a solid plan to deal with that, that's not suicide, because I don't think that's what anybody should be doing as we age. But so what are some things that providers should be doing?
Yeah, I think in addition to the kinds of mental health screens that we've talked about, I think it's becoming the standard of care for long-term care providers to do some type of violence screen when people are being admitted into this, continuum of care, because I think that the risk of unaffirming family members is significant for any people who are aging, but it's certainly, we know it's significant for folks in the LGBTQ community and for people in the trans and non-binary community in particular. So they need to be aware if there are potentially abusive or violent risks that are associated with family members or other people who are in the patient's life or resident's life. And they likewise need to learn who are the patient's trusted and chosen caregivers, chosen family, which is a term that LGBT people commonly use to describe, the close family ties that we have with people in our lives that may not be related by blood. And I think even to go a step further than that providers need to be talking about dementia risks with transgender people. And I think that needs to happen well before a patient or resident is entering a long-term care facility. I think this is something that can, occur as early as someone's 40s. This isn't solely an end of life issue. So I think proactively helping people plan for dementia with things like advanced care planning tools is something that providers can do now to help trans people to feel like some peace of mind in the present moment, that this thing that we're afraid of, like we have made a plan about this to the extent that we have agency to make decisions about that. We're doing that now. And that may also have benefits in the future to perhaps intervene before discrimination occurs from a healthcare provider or from an unaffirming family member.
Right. And I also think that, anyone should be looking at kind of their lifestyle choices, making sure you're getting enough sleep, that you're eating a healthy diet, you're getting exercise, all the same kind of basic preventive strategies are true in this population as for any. So, so as we close out, maybe talk a little bit now about some of the different resources if someone would like to know more, and also how they could get in touch with you if they'd like to learn more about your work.
Sure. Like I wish that I had more things to refer people to. This is also a call to the research community to make sure that we're performing intersectional structural research on transgender and non-binary people who are aging. There was this study that I referred to earlier by Ethan Cicero and Elle Lett, who are both amazing trans researchers, that was just published in the Journals of Gerontology, that I would commend to people, that shows this disproportionate risk. People can also check out a new partnership between the Human Rights Campaign Foundation and the Alzheimer's Association. They are working on resources for community members and for the provider community around trans inclusivity with Alzheimer's care. And more generally, the Human Rights Campaign Foundation has also partnered with SAGE, which is an LGBTQ services and advocacy group for LGBTQ elders, to produce the Long-Term Care Equality Index. The survey just had its first test in the field, or I guess it wasn't a test. We just had the first edition of the Long-Term Care Equality Index survey in the field. And this survey looks at residential long-term care providers and what LGBTQ affirming policies and procedures they have. We should have a report from HRC and SAGE at some point later in 2023 that community members can use to see if there is a long-term care facility in their community who has taken the Long-Term Care Equality Index. There are some measures of gender affirming services that are part of the criteria for the LEI, as we call it. But they are only policies, right? Like we shouldn't, the LEI isn't a measure of people's lived experience in long-term care facilities. And so folks should bear that in mind. But I do think that if you are a trans person trying to think about where is a long-term care facility where I might be safer from discrimination and mistreatment than others, the LEI would be a good place to look. And I also think that the criteria should be instructive for long-term care providers. The things that HRC and SAGE thinks are important for long-term care providers are listed in those criteria. So even if you didn't take the survey, these are policies that you can begin implementing at your facility now.
Okay, if you saw that, my cat tried to jump up here. Anyways, well, thank you for all of those. I'm going to include a link in the show notes and in the blog on my website, Melissa B. PhD, for the Trans Inclusivity and Alzheimer's Care with the Human Rights Campaign. We'll include a link to the Long-Term Care Equality Index and a link to Ethan's and his other authors to their to the publication that you mentioned. And I hope people will join us for the podcast we're getting ready to do next on advanced directives for this population. So thank you so much for being with me today and sharing your expertise and highlighting this really important aspect of care that I think is often overlooked and not discussed enough. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Melissa. It's really important to help raise awareness. I'm really grateful that you had me on the podcast. And folks can feel free to reach out to me at Duke if they want more information.
Okay. Do you have an email address for them?
Yes, simmons@law.duke.edu.
Okay. Thank you so much. So join us next as we talk about advanced directives and the transgender population. Thank you for tuning in to This is Getting Old, Moving Towards an Age-Friendly World. I'm your host, Melissa Batchelor, and if you'd like to learn more, you can check out my other episodes on my YouTube channel by subscribing and ringing the bell to get immediate notifications when new content comes out. In addition, you can also find the audio version of the podcast on Amazon Music, Spotify, iTunes, and Stitcher. Please feel free to leave an honest review because more reviews mean more awareness of the podcast and helps us move towards an age-friendly world. If you have a comment or a question, you can visit my website, melissabphd.com. Go to the Contact Melissa tab, and you can leave me a voice message. You never know, it might just include your question or your comment in an upcoming episode.